My name is Conlon Bishop, and I've always had a knack for finding trouble. It's not something I actively sought out, but somehow it always seemed to find me. Maybe it was my restless spirit or my insatiable curiosity for the unknown. Whatever the reason, I never took it seriously until that fateful day in June 2019. I was 32 years old, working as a freelance journalist in Chicago, when I received a call from my old college buddy, Graham Calhoun. Graham and I had been thick as thieves during our university days, bonding over our shared love for adventure and the unconventional. While I channeled my restlessness into writing, Graham found his calling in real estate, particularly in renovating and flipping old properties. "Conlon, my man," Graham's enthusiastic voice boomed through the phone. "I've just closed on the deal of a lifetime and I need your help." I chuckled, already sensing the excitement in his voice. "Let me guess, another rundown mansion that's going to make you millions?" "Even better," he replied. "I bought an old plantation house just outside New Orleans. This place has history, Conlon. Real spine-tingling history." I felt a familiar tingle of anticipation. Graham's projects were always interesting, but there was something in his tone that piqued my curiosity even more than usual. "What kind of history are we talking about?" I asked, already reaching for my laptop to book a flight. Graham's voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. "Ever heard of the Bayou Beast?" I paused, my finger hovering over the Book Now button. "The what now?" "The Bayou Beast," Graham repeated, relishing each syllable. "It's a local legend, some kind of creature that's been spotted around these parts for over a century. Part man, part animal, with an appetite for trouble." I laughed, but it came out a bit forced. "Sounds like the perfect subject for my next article. When do you want me there?" "As soon as you can make it," Graham replied. "I'll text you the address. Trust me, Conlon, you won't want to miss this." As I hung up the phone and finalized my travel plans, I couldn't shake the feeling that this trip would be different from our usual adventures. Little did I know just how right that feeling would turn out to be. The flight to New Orleans was uneventful, but as I drove out to the address Graham had sent me, the landscape began to change. The bustling city gave way to quiet suburbs, which in turn melted into the lush, primordial landscape of the bayou. The air grew thick and heavy, clinging to my skin like a damp cloth. As I turned onto a narrow, overgrown road, I caught my first glimpse of Graham's latest project. The plantation house loomed before me, a decaying giant rising from the mist. Its once white paint was now a sickly gray, peeling away to reveal the weathered wood beneath. Vines crawled up the columns of the front porch, nature slowly reclaiming what man had built. Graham was waiting for me on the porch, a broad grin on his face. As I stepped out of the car, the humid air hit me like a wall, and I could hear the distant chorus of cicadas and frogs. "Welcome to Cypress Grove Plantation," Graham called out, spreading his arms wide. "What do you think?" I looked up at the imposing structure, taking in its dilapidated grandeur. "I think you've outdone yourself this time, Graham. This place is something else." Graham laughed, clapping me on the back as I climbed the creaking steps to join him on the porch. "Just wait until you see the inside, and wait until you hear the stories about this place." As we stepped through the front door, the house seemed to exhale, a gust of stale, musty air rushing past us. I suppressed a shiver, telling myself it was just the change in temperature from the humid outdoors to the cooler interior. "So," I said, my voice echoing slightly in the empty foyer, "tell me more about this Bayou Beast of yours." Graham's eyes gleamed with excitement. "Oh, Conlon, you're in for a treat. But first, let's get you settled in. We've got a long night ahead of us." As I followed Graham up the creaking staircase to the guest room, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching us. It was ridiculous, of course, just my imagination running wild with the atmosphere and Graham's talk of legends. But as I glanced back down the stairs, I could have sworn I saw a shadow move in the corner of my eye. Welcome to Cypress Grove Plantation, indeed. The guest room Graham led me to was spacious but as run down as the rest of the house. A large four-poster bed dominated the center, its once ornate carvings now dulled and chipped. A thick layer of dust covered every surface, and cobwebs adorned the corners like macabre decorations. "Sorry about the state of things," Graham said, looking slightly embarrassed. "I haven't had a chance to start the renovations yet, but don't worry, I've at least made sure the bed is clean and comfortable." I set my bag down on a rickety chair, sending up a small cloud of dust. No worries, Graham. I've slept in worse places for a story. Graham's face lit up. That's the spirit. Now how about we crack open a couple of beers and I'll fill you in on the history of this place? We made our way back downstairs to the kitchen, where Graham had set up a makeshift living area with a couple of folding chairs and a cooler full of drinks. As we settled in, I couldn't help but notice how the fading light outside seemed to deepen the shadows within the house. So, Graham began, handing me a cold beer. Cypress Grove Plantation, built in 1842 by a man named Jeremiah Wilkes. He was a wealthy cotton farmer, known for his cruelty to his slaves and his eccentric behavior. I took a swig of my beer, feeling the cold liquid contrast with the oppressive heat. Eccentric how? Graham leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. They say he was obsessed with the occult. There were rumors of strange rituals performed in the woods behind the house, of animals going missing, of slaves disappearing without a trace. A chill ran down my spine despite the warmth of the evening. And the Bayou Beast? How does that fit into all this? Now that's where it gets interesting, Graham said, his eyes gleaming. The legend of the Bayou Beast predates the plantation, but it became intertwined with the history of this place. Some say Wilkes tried to summon the creature to harness its power. Others say he created it through his twisted experiments. I raised an eyebrow. Created it? How? Graham shrugged. The stories vary. Some talk about dark magic, others about some kind of primitive genetic manipulation. But all the stories agree on one thing. Whatever Wilkes did, it went horribly wrong. As if on cue, a loud creak echoed through the house. We both jumped, then laughed nervously. Probably just the house settling, I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. Graham nodded, but his eyes darted around the room. Yeah, probably. Anyway, Wilkes disappeared in 1865, right after the Civil War ended. The plantation changed hands several times after that, but no one ever stayed for long. There were always stories, sightings of a strange creature in the woods, unexplained noises, people going missing. I took another drink, mulling over the information. And you bought this place knowing all that? Graham grinned. Are you kidding? That's why I bought it. Can you imagine the tourist potential once we renovate? Stay the night in the haunted plantation home of the Bayou Beast. We'll make a fortune. I shook my head, smiling. You always did have a nose for opportunity, Graham. But aren't you worried about, stirring up something better left alone? For a moment, Graham's confident facade slipped, and I saw a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. Nah, it's all just stories, Conlon. Besides, even if there was something to it, it's been quiet for years. Whatever was here is long gone. As the night wore on, we continued to talk, catching up on old times and discussing Graham's plans for the renovation. But as much as I tried to focus on our conversation, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every creak of the house, every rustle from outside seemed to carry a hidden meaning. More than once, I caught myself staring into the dark corners of the room, half expecting to see something staring back. Finally, as the clock on my phone showed well past midnight, we decided to call it a night. As I climbed the stairs to my room, the wood groaning beneath my feet, Graham called out from below. Sleep tight, Conlon. Don't let the Bayou Beast bite. I forced a laugh, but it sounded hollow even to my own ears. In my room, I changed quickly and climbed into bed, the springs creaking ominously beneath me. Despite my exhaustion, sleep was elusive. Every sound seemed amplified in the quiet of the night. The wind whistling through cracks in the walls sounded like whispers. The scratching of tree branches against the window became claws seeking entry. And beneath it all, so faint I might have imagined it, I could swear I heard something moving in the walls. A steady, rhythmic sound, like breathing, or perhaps a heartbeat. As I finally drifted off to an uneasy sleep, one thought kept circling in my mind. What had Graham gotten us into? I woke with a start, sunlight streaming through the grimy windows. For a moment, I couldn't remember where I was. Then it all came flooding back. The plantation, Graham's stories, the unsettling noises in the night. Shaking off the remnants of sleep, I made my way downstairs. The house looked different in the daylight, less menacing but no less decrepit. Graham was already in the kitchen, hunched over a battered laptop. Morning, sleepyhead, he called out as I entered. Coffee's on the counter. Hope you slept well? I grunted non-committally, making a beeline for the coffee pot. As well as can be expected in a creaky old house. What's the plan for today? Graham's eyes lit up with excitement. Today we start exploring. I want to map out the entire property, get a feel for what we're working with. There's over 50 acres of land here, including some dense woods behind the house. As we sipped our coffee, Graham pulled up some old maps of the property on his laptop. "Look at this," he said, pointing to a spot deep in the woods. "There's supposed to be some kind of structure back there. The previous owners didn't know much about it, but I'm betting it's tied to those stories about Wilkes and his experiments." A chill ran down my spine despite the warmth of the day. "And you want to go looking for it?" Graham grinned. "Of course. Aren't you curious?" I was, despite my better judgment. The journalist in me couldn't resist the lure of a good story, even if part of me was screaming that this was a bad idea. We spent the morning clearing debris from around the house, Graham making notes on what needed to be repaired or replaced. As we worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. More than once I caught movement out of the corner of my eye, only to turn and find nothing there. After a quick lunch of sandwiches, we geared up for our expedition into the woods. Graham had prepared backpacks with water, snacks, and basic first aid supplies. He also handed me a machete. "For the undergrowth," he explained, seeing my surprised look. "It gets pretty dense out there." As we stepped off the overgrown lawn and into the tree line, the atmosphere changed immediately. The air grew cooler, the light dimmer. The sounds of the outside world faded away, replaced by the rustling of leaves and the occasional call of a bird. We pushed deeper into the woods, following the old map as best we could. The undergrowth was thick, forcing us to hack our way through in places. After about an hour of trekking, Graham called for a break. As we sat on a fallen log, catching our breath, I noticed something odd about our surroundings. The woods were eerily quiet. No bird calls, no rustling of small animals, just an oppressive silence. "Graham," I said, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. "Does something feel off to you?" He looked around, frowning. "Now that you mention it, yeah, it's too quiet." Just as he finished speaking, a twig snapped somewhere behind us. We both whirled around, but there was nothing there. "Probably just an animal," Graham said, but he didn't sound convinced. We pressed on, the silence growing heavier with each step. The trees seemed to close in around us, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. More than once I could have sworn I saw shapes moving just at the edge of my vision, but every time I turned to look, there was nothing there. Finally, after what felt like hours, we stumbled into a small clearing. In the center stood the remains of a stone structure, half reclaimed by nature. Vines crawled up its walls, and part of the roof had caved in. "This must be it," Graham said, his voice hushed with awe. "Wilkes' laboratory." We approached cautiously. The entrance was partially blocked by fallen debris, but we managed to squeeze through. Inside, it was dark and musty. Graham pulled out a flashlight, its beam cutting through the gloom. The interior was a single room, maybe 20 feet square. Rotting wooden shelves lined the walls, holding an assortment of dusty bottles and rusted instruments. In the center of the room stood a large stone table, its surface stained with dark patches I didn't want to examine too closely. "Look at this place," Graham whispered, running his hand along one of the shelves. "It's like stepping back in time." I nodded, unable to shake a growing sense of unease. "Graham, maybe we shouldn't be here. This place, it feels wrong." He turned to me, his face lit eerily by the flashlight. "Don't tell me you're buying into those old stories, Conlon. This is history. Think of the story you could write about this place." Before I could respond, a low growl echoed through the trees outside. We froze, looking at each other with wide eyes. "What was that?" I whispered. Graham shook his head, his earlier bravado faltering. "I don't know. Maybe a wild dog?" The growl came again, closer this time. It didn't sound like any dog I'd ever heard. It was deeper, more guttural, almost inhuman. "We need to get out of here," I said, already backing towards the entrance. Graham nodded, his face pale in the dim light. "Yeah, good idea." We squeezed back out of the structure and into the clearing. The woods around us seemed darker than before, the shadows deeper and more menacing. The growl came again, seeming to come from all directions at once. "Run," Graham said, and we took off. We crashed through the undergrowth, branches whipping at our faces, roots threatening to trip us with every step. Behind us, I could hear something moving through the woods, something big. The sound of snapping branches and heavy footfalls spurred us on, terror lending wings to our feet. I don't know how long we ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that green hell. But finally, mercifully, we burst out of the tree line and onto the overgrown lawn of the plantation house. We didn't stop running until we were inside, slamming the door behind us and leaning against it, gasping for breath. What? What the hell was that? I panted, my heart pounding in my chest. Graham shook his head, his eyes wide with fear. I don't know. As our breathing slowly returned to normal, we looked at each other. The realization dawned on us simultaneously. The legends might be more than just stories, and we might have just awakened something that should have been left sleeping. The plantation house suddenly felt less like a refuge and more like a trap. As the sun began to set outside, casting long shadows across the floor, one thought echoed in my mind. We were in way over our heads. The rest of the afternoon passed in a haze of nervous energy and hushed conversations. Graham and I pored over the old maps and documents he had collected about the property, searching for any clue that might explain what we had encountered in the woods. But the more we read, the more questions we had. As night fell, the plantation house seemed to come alive with creaks and groans. Every sound made us jump, our nerves frayed to the breaking point. We decided to barricade ourselves in the living room, pushing heavy furniture against the doors and windows. Maybe we should leave, I suggested, my voice barely above a whisper. Drive back to New Orleans and come back in the daylight with help. Graham shook his head, his face pale in the flickering light of the candles we had lit. We can't. Whatever's out there, it's between us and the car. We're safer in here. I wasn't so sure about that, but I didn't argue. We settled in for a long night, taking turns to keep watch while the other tried to rest. It was during my watch, sometime in the early hours of the morning, that I first heard it. A scratching sound coming from the walls. At first I thought it might be rats or some other small animal, but as I listened I realized the sound was too deliberate, too rhythmic. Graham, I hissed, shaking him awake. Do you hear that? He sat up, rubbing his eyes. Hear what? Then the scratching stopped, replaced by a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the very foundations of the house. Graham's eyes widened in terror. It's inside, he whispered. Before I could respond, there was a tremendous crash from upstairs. It sounded like something large had just demolished a wall. Dust rained down from the ceiling as heavy footsteps moved across the floor above us. We scrambled to our feet, pressing our backs against the wall furthest from the door. The footsteps grew closer, descending the stairs with agonizing slowness. Each step was punctuated by a low growl that sent shivers down my spine. Then silence. Whatever it was right outside the living room door. For a moment, nothing happened. Then slowly, the door began to bulge inward, the wood splintering under some immense pressure. The furniture we had piled against it began to slide across the floor. The window, Graham gasped. We have to get out. We rushed to the window, frantically pushing aside the heavy bookcase we had used to block it. Behind us, the door gave way with a deafening crack. I turned, and for the first time, I saw it clearly. The bayou beast was real, and it was more terrifying than any legend could have prepared me for. It stood nearly 8 feet tall, its body a nightmarish fusion of human and animal. Matted fur covered most of its massive frame, but in places I could see patches of scaly reptilian skin. Its face was a twisted parody of humanity, with a protruding snout filled with razor-sharp teeth and eyes that glowed with an unnatural yellowish light. For a heartbeat, we all stood frozen, Graham and I paralyzed with fear, the beast seemingly surprised to find us there. Then with a roar that shook the windows, it charged. Go, I yelled, shoving Graham towards the now open window. He scrambled through, and I followed close behind, the beast's claws missing my back by inches. We hit the ground running, sprinting across the overgrown lawn towards the tree line. Behind us, I could hear the beast crashing through the window, its heavy footfalls gaining on us with terrifying speed. The old lab? Graham panted as we reached the woods. It's our only chance? I wanted to argue, to say that running deeper into the woods was madness, but I knew he was right. We had no hope of outrunning this thing in open ground. Our only chance was to lose it in the dense undergrowth and hope we could find our way to the relative safety of the stone structure. We plunged into the darkness of the forest, branches whipping at our faces as we ran blindly through the night. The beast was right behind us, its growls and the sound of snapping trees spurring us on despite our burning lungs and aching muscles. How we found the clearing in the dark, I'll never know. Maybe it was blind luck, or maybe some remnant of Wilkes's dark magic drew us there. Either way, we suddenly burst into the open space, the ruined lab looming before us like a sanctuary. We dove inside, Graham immediately moving to push a heavy stone slab across the entrance. I added my strength to his, and together we managed to seal the opening just as the beast reached it. The whole structure shook as it slammed against the stone, roaring in frustration. "What now?" I gasped, sliding down the wall to sit on the floor, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Graham shook his head, his face a mask of terror and exhaustion. I don't know. Outside, the beast continued to rage, its claws scraping against the stone as it searched for a way in. We huddled in the darkness, jumping at every sound, wondering how long our makeshift fortress would hold. As the night wore on, the beast's attacks became less frequent, but we dared not lower our guard. We knew it was out there, waiting, and we were trapped with no food, no water, and no way to call for help. In the faint light that filtered through cracks in the roof, I could see strange symbols carved into the walls and floor of the lab. They seemed to pulse with a faint, sickly light, growing stronger as dawn approached. "Graham," I whispered, pointing to the symbols. "What are those?" He shook his head, his eyes wide. "I don't know, but I've got a bad feeling about this." As if in response to his words, the symbols flared to life, bathing the room in an eerie, greenish glow. Outside, the beast let out a howl that was equal parts pain and rage. We pressed ourselves against the far wall, watching in horror as the stone slab blocking the entrance began to move on its own, sliding aside to reveal the pre-dawn gloom outside. There, silhouetted against the lightning sky, stood the bayou beast. But something was different. Its form seemed to be shifting, changing before our eyes. As we watched, frozen in terror, it began to shrink, its bestial features melting away to reveal something even more horrifying. A man stood before us, naked and covered in dirt and blood. But his eyes still glowed with that unnatural yellowish light. He smiled, revealing teeth that were still far too sharp to be human. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice a low growl, "I believe we have much to discuss." As he stepped into the lab, the stone slab slid back into place behind him, sealing us in with a creature that was neither fully man nor beast. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my core, that our nightmare was far from over. It was only just beginning. The man, if you could call him that, stood before us, his unnaturally yellow eyes scanning the room with predatory intensity. Despite his human appearance, there was an air of barely contained savagery about him, as if the beast we had seen was just beneath the surface, ready to emerge at any moment. "Who? What are you?" Graham stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. The man's lips curled into a smile that was more snarl than expression of joy. "I have been called many things over the years, the Bayou Beast, the Wilkes Abomination, but you may call me Jeremiah." I felt my blood run cold. "Jeremiah Wilkes? But that's impossible. You'd be over 200 years old." Jeremiah laughed, a harsh grating sound that set my teeth on edge. "Impossible? After what you've seen, you still cling to such notions? Yes, I am Jeremiah Wilkes, or what remains of him." He began to pace the small confines of the lab, his movements fluid yet somehow wrong, as if his body wasn't quite sure how to be human anymore. "I was a man of science, you see, ahead of my time. I sought to unlock the secrets of life itself, to transcend the limitations of the human form." "The experiments," Graham breathed, realization dawning on his face. "The legends were true." Jeremiah nodded, a look of pride crossing his features. "Indeed. I discovered things that your modern science is only beginning to grasp. The malleability of DNA, the power of certain, let's call them mystical catalysts. I thought I could create the perfect being, one that combined the best aspects of man and beast." He stopped pacing, turning to face us fully. In the eerie glow of the symbols, I could see the pain and madness in his eyes. "But I was arrogant, foolish. The process was flawed. the transformation incomplete. I became trapped between two worlds, neither fully human nor fully animal. A monster, doomed to stalk these woods for eternity. "But why attack us?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "We didn't do anything to you." Jeremiah's eyes flashed with anger. "You disturbed my rest. For decades I have slumbered, only emerging when the hunger became too great to bear. But you," he pointed an accusing finger at Graham, "you came here with your machines and your plans. You woke me from my slumber, and now the hunger is upon me once more." Graham paled, shrinking back against the wall. I'm sorry, I didn't know." "Sorry?" Jeremiah snarled, his features beginning to shift, becoming more bestial. "Sorry won't sate my hunger. Sorry won't undo what has been done." I stepped forward, placing myself between Graham and the increasingly agitated Jeremiah. "Wait, maybe we can help you. There must be a way to reverse what was done to you." For a moment, Jeremiah seemed to consider my words. Then he threw back his head and laughed, a sound that was half human chuckle, half animal roar. "Reverse it? Boy, I've had 2 centuries to try to reverse it. There is no cure, no salvation. There is only the hunger, and the brief respite that comes with satisfying it." As he spoke, his transformation accelerated. Fur sprouted from his skin, his bones cracked and reformed, and his face elongated into the bestial snout we had seen before. Within moments, the man was gone, replaced once more by the terrifying bayou beast. "Run," I whispered to Graham, not taking my eyes off the creature before us. "When I say go, run for the entrance. I'll try to hold it off." "But," Graham started to protest. "No buts," I cut him off. "One of us needs to make it out of here to tell the story. You're faster than me, you have a better chance." Before Graham could argue further, I lunged forward, grabbing a rusted piece of equipment from one of the shelves and swinging it at Jeremiah's head. "Go!" I yelled. Graham hesitated for a split second, then bolted for the entrance. Jeremiah roared, more in annoyance than pain, and swatted me aside like I was nothing more than an irritating insect. I hit the wall hard, my vision blurring from the impact. Through the haze, I saw Graham struggling with the stone slab, trying to push it aside. Jeremiah turned towards him, murder in his glowing eyes. "No!" I shouted, struggling to my feet. In desperation, I grabbed one of the bottles from the shelf and hurled it at Jeremiah's back. The bottle shattered on impact, releasing a cloud of ancient noxious chemicals. Jeremiah howled in pain, his fur smoking where the liquid had touched him. He whirled back towards me, his eyes now filled with a terrible, focused rage. "Graham, go," I yelled, already knowing it was too late for me. "Get help!" I saw Graham finally push the slab aside and slip out into the pre-dawn light. Then Jeremiah was upon me, his massive form blocking out everything else. As his claws descended, I closed my eyes, bracing for the end. But instead of the tearing of flesh, I heard a strange, high-pitched whine. I opened my eyes to see Jeremiah frozen in place, his body racked with spasms. The symbols on the walls and floor were glowing brighter than ever, pulsing with an otherworldly energy. Jeremiah howled, a sound of pure agony that shook the very foundations of the lab. Then in a flash of blinding light he was gone, not transformed back into a man, not moved to another spot, but simply gone, vanished into thin air, leaving behind nothing but the acrid smell of ozone and burnt fur. I stood there stunned, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. Was Jeremiah dead, transported somewhere else, or had he simply become invisible? As the glow of the symbols faded, plunging the lab back into near darkness, I realized it didn't matter. What mattered was that I was alive, and I needed to get out of here. On shaky legs, I made my way to the entrance, pushing aside the stone slab with strength born of desperation and fear. As I stumbled out into the woods, the first rays of dawn were just beginning to pierce the canopy. I had survived the night, but as I looked back at the ominous stone structure, I knew that my ordeal was far from over. The mystery of Jeremiah Wilkes and the Bayou Beast was deeper than I had ever imagined, and I had a feeling it wasn't done with me yet. With one last look at the lab, I turned and began the long trek back to the plantation house, hoping against hope that Graham had made it to safety. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere in the shadows of the bayou, a pair of glowing yellow eyes was watching my every move. The beast might be gone for now, but its legacy lived on, and I had a sinking feeling that this was only the beginning of a much larger, much more terrifying story. The walk back to the plantation house was a blur of exhaustion and paranoia. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig sent my heart racing. By the time I stumbled onto the overgrown lawn, the sun was well above the horizon, casting long shadows across the dilapidated structure. "Graham?" I called out, my voice hoarse. "Graham, are you here?" Silence greeted me. I made my way into the house, half expecting to find it in ruins after Jeremiah's rampage. But everything was as we had left it, save for the splintered remains of the living room door. I checked every room, calling Graham's name, but there was no sign of him. Had he made it back? Had he gone for help? Or had something worse befallen him in the woods? As I stood in the kitchen, trying to decide what to do next, I heard the sound of tires on gravel. My heart leapt. Maybe Graham had returned with help. I rushed to the front door, throwing it open. But it wasn't Graham. A police cruiser had pulled up in front of the house, and 2 officers were getting out, their hands resting cautiously on their holstered weapons. "Conlon Bishop," one of them called out. "We got a call from a Graham Calhoun. Said there was some kind of emergency out here." Relief flooded through me. Graham had made it out. He was safe. "Yes, that's me," I said, stepping out onto the porch with my hands raised to show I wasn't a threat. "Thank God you're here. You're not going to believe what happened." The officers exchanged a look that I recognized all too well. The look of people dealing with someone they suspect might be unhinged. "Why don't you tell us what's going on, Mr. Bishop?" the first officer said, his tone cautious. So I told them. Everything. About Jeremiah Wilkes, the Bayou Beast, the chase through the woods, and the strange disappearance in the lab. As I spoke, I could see the disbelief growing on their faces. When I finished, there was a long silence. Finally, the second officer spoke up. "Mr. Bishop, have you been drinking, or perhaps taking any substances?" I felt a flash of anger. "No. I know how it sounds, but I'm telling you the truth. Go look in the woods, you'll find the lab. There are claw marks, signs of a struggle, and Graham can back me up." "Where is he? Is he okay?" The first officer held up a hand. "Mr. Calhoun is fine. He's at the station giving his statement. But his story, well, it's a bit different from yours." My blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" "He says you 2 were out exploring the woods last night and got spooked by some animal noises. Says you both panicked and got separated. He made it back to town and called us, worried about you." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. That's not what happened. Why would he lie? I stared at the officers in disbelief, my mind racing. Why would Graham lie about what happened? Was he trying to protect himself somehow? Or had something more sinister occurred? "Look," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I know how this sounds, but I'm telling you the truth. There's something out there in those woods, something dangerous. We need to investigate the old lab structure. It's where everything happened." The officers exchanged another glance. The first one, whose nameplate read Officer Thibodeau, sighed. "All right, Mr. Bishop, why don't you show us this lab you're talking about? But I'm warning you, if this is some kind of prank or wild goose chase, you could be facing charges." I nodded eagerly, relief washing over me. "Yes, of course, thank you. It's about an hour's hike into the woods. I can lead you there." The second officer, Broussard, according to his nameplate, radioed in our plans while Thibodeau got some equipment from the cruiser. Soon we were heading into the woods with me in the lead. As we hiked, I couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. The forest seemed different in the daylight, less menacing but also less magical, for lack of a better word. What if we got there and found nothing? What if the lab had vanished along with Jeremiah? After what felt like an eternity of pushing through undergrowth and navigating around fallen trees, we finally reached the clearing where the lab should have been. My heart sank. The clearing was empty. No stone structure, no signs of a struggle, not even a foundation or any debris to suggest a building had ever stood there. I don't understand," I stammered, spinning around as if the lab might suddenly appear. "It was right here. I swear it was right here." Officer Thibodeau's face hardened. "Mr. Bishop, I think we've heard enough. You're coming with us back to the station. We need to have a serious talk about filing false reports and wasting police resources." As they led me back through the woods, my mind was reeling. Had it all been a hallucination? Some kind of shared delusion between Graham and me? But no, it had felt too real. The terror, the pain, the smells and sounds, they couldn't have all been in my head. Back at the plantation house, I was handcuffed and placed in the back of the police cruiser. As we drove away, I caught a glimpse of movement in one of the upper windows of the house. For just a moment, I could have sworn I saw a pair of glowing yellow eyes watching us leave. At the police station, I was led to an interrogation room and left to stew for what felt like hours. Finally, the door opened, and in walked Graham, followed by a detective. "Graham," I exclaimed, relief flooding through me. "Thank God you're okay. Tell them what happened. Tell them about Jeremiah and the beast." But Graham wouldn't meet my eyes. He looked pale and shaken, dark circles under his eyes suggesting he hadn't slept. "I'm sorry, Conlon," he said softly. "I don't know what you're talking about. We got scared in the woods, that's all. There was no monster, no lab. You must have hit your head or something. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut." "What?" "Graham, no, you know what we saw. Why are you lying?" The detective stepped forward. "Mr. Bishop, Mr. Calhoun has been very cooperative. He's explained how you two went out to the property to start planning renovations, had a few too many beers, and decided to explore the woods at night. You got spooked by some animal noises and ran off in different directions. Mr. Calhoun made it back to town and called for help. That's all that happened. Do you understand?" I shook my head, feeling a mixture of betrayal and desperation. "No, that's not... Graham, please, tell them the truth." But Graham just shook his head, still not meeting my gaze. "I'm sorry, Conlon, I don't know what else to say." The next few hours were a blur of questions, accusations, and my increasingly desperate attempts to convince them of the truth. But without any evidence, and with Graham contradicting everything I said, it was a losing battle. Finally, after I'd been charged with filing a false report and trespassing, apparently Graham claimed I didn't have permission to be on the property, I was released on bail, with strict instructions not to leave town. As I stood outside the police station, the humid Louisiana air feeling oppressive, I tried to make sense of what had happened. Why would Graham lie? Was he being threatened? Or had something happened to him in the woods, something that made him forget or choose to forget? One thing was certain. I couldn't let this go. The mystery of Jeremiah Wilkes and the Bayou Beast was far from solved, and I was determined to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. Little did I know my ordeal was far from over. In fact, it was about to get much, much worse. The next few days passed in a haze of frustration and mounting paranoia. I was stuck in a small motel on the outskirts of town. My attempts to contact Graham met with stony silence. The local newspaper had run a small story about the plantation prankster, painting me as some kind of attention-seeking troublemaker. But I knew what I had seen, what we had both seen, and I was determined to prove it. I spent my days combing through local archives, searching for any information about Jeremiah Wilkes and the history of Cypress Grove Plantation. The nights were worse, filled with vivid nightmares of glowing yellow eyes and bestial roars. It was on the third day of my research that I stumbled upon something interesting. An old newspaper article from 1865, just after Wilkes's disappearance, mentioned a series of strange animal attacks in the area. The victims were found mauled, but the wounds were described as unlike any known predator. The attacks had continued sporadically over the years, always clustered around periods when the plantation changed hands. It was as if each new owner awakened something in the woods. Armed with this new information, I decided to risk returning to the plantation. I knew it was dangerous, possibly illegal given the charges against me, but I had to find some concrete evidence. I waited until nightfall, then drove out to the property. The house loomed before me, somehow more menacing than ever in the moonlight. I parked a distance away and approached on foot, my heart pounding with every step. As I crept onto the porch, I noticed something odd. The front door, which had been splintered during Jeremiah's attack, was now whole. In fact, it looked brand new. I tried the handle, and to my surprise, it turned easily. The door swung open with a soft creak, revealing the darkened interior. "Hello?" I called out softly, stepping inside. "Graham, are you here?" No response. I pulled out my flashlight and began to explore. The interior of the house had changed. Gone was the dust and decay we had seen just days ago. The floors were polished, the walls freshly painted. It looked like the renovation had been completed in a matter of days, an impossible feat. As I moved through the rooms, a sense of unreality settled over me. This couldn't be happening. Had I finally lost my mind? I was so lost in my thoughts that I almost missed it. A soft sound coming from upstairs. Footsteps. My heart in my throat, I slowly ascended the stairs, wincing at every creak of the wood beneath my feet. The sound was coming from the end of the hallway, from the room that had been my guest room during my stay. I approached the door, my hand shaking as I reached for the knob. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, then threw the door open. The room was empty. But it had changed, just like the rest of the house. Gone was the dusty, decrepit furniture. In its place was a pristine bedroom that looked like it belonged in the 19th century, and there on the bedside table was a leather-bound journal. I approached cautiously, half expecting it to disappear like some kind of mirage, but it was real. I picked it up, running my fingers over the worn cover. Embossed in fading gold letters was a name, Jeremiah Wilkes. With trembling hands, I opened the journal. The pages were filled with dense, spidery handwriting, diagrams of twisted anatomies and cryptic symbols that made my head hurt to look at. I began to read, and as I did, the true horror of what Jeremiah Wilkes had done began to unfold before me. The experiments hadn't just been about combining man and beast. Wilkes had been trying to achieve immortality, to create a being that could shift between forms at will. But the process required sacrifices, human sacrifices. The final pages of the journal described Wilkes's ultimate experiment, on himself. But something had gone wrong. The transformation had been incomplete, trapping him between forms. And the hunger was insatiable. As I read the last entry, dated just days before Wilkes's supposed disappearance, a chill ran down my spine. I can feel it changing me, consuming me, but I cannot stop. The hunger is too great. I fear what I may become, what I may do. If you are reading this, beware. The beast is not just in the bayou, it is in the very walls of this house, in the land itself, and it is always, always hungry. I closed the journal, my mind reeling. This was the proof I needed. But as I turned to leave, I found my way blocked. Graham stood in the doorway, but he wasn't the Graham I knew. His eyes glowed with that same unnatural yellow light I had seen in Jeremiah's eyes. "I told you to let it go, Conlon," he said, his voice a low growl. "I tried to protect you, but the hunger must be satisfied." As he stepped into the room, his form began to shift and change, and I realized, with a horror that chilled me to my very soul, that the nightmare was far from over. It was only just beginning. I stood frozen, watching in horror as Graham's body contorted and shifted. Fur sprouted from his skin, his face elongated into a bestial snout, and his fingers lengthened into deadly claws. Within moments, the Graham I knew was gone, replaced by the terrifying form of the bayou beast. "Graham," I gasped, backing away until I hit the wall. "What? How?" The creature that had been Graham let out a low, rumbling laugh. Graham is gone. He was weak, unable to embrace the gift, but I am so much more." My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. "Jeremiah? But how? The lab? You disappeared?" "Disappeared?" The beast chuckled, a sound that sent shivers down my spine. "No, my boy. I became one with this place. The house, the land, they are extensions of me now. And when your friend Graham came sniffing around, well, let's just say I found a new vessel." I clutched Wilkes's journal to my chest as if it could somehow protect me. "You possessed him? But why? Why all this deception?" The beast's yellow eyes gleamed with malevolent intelligence. "Survival, my dear Conlon. For too long I was bound to this land, unable to leave, forced to hibernate for years at a time. But now, with a new body, I can finally be free. Free to roam, free to hunt, free to satisfy the hunger that has plagued me for over a century." It took a step towards me, saliva dripping from its fangs. "And you, my inquisitive friend, will be the first to nourish me in this new form." I knew I had only seconds to act. With all my strength, I hurled Wilkes's journal at the beast's face. It roared in surprise and anger, momentarily distracted. I seized the opportunity and dove past it, sprinting out of the room and down the stairs. I could hear the beast crashing after me, its claws tearing into the wooden floors. I burst out of the front door and into the night. running blindly towards where I had parked my car. But as I reached the spot, my heart sank. The car was gone. Of course it was. This wasn't just a beast I was dealing with. It was an intelligent, calculating predator. With no other choice, I plunged into the woods, hoping against hope that I could somehow lose my pursuer in the darkness. Behind me, I could hear the beast's roars echoing through the trees, getting closer with each passing second. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like lead. Just when I thought I couldn't go on, I burst into a familiar clearing, the lab. It was back, standing as if it had never disappeared. Without hesitation, I rushed inside, slamming the stone door shut behind me. In the dim light filtering through the cracks, I could see that the lab was as we had left it that fateful night, dusty, filled with strange equipment and bottles of unknown substances. I frantically searched for something, anything that could help me. My eyes fell on a shelf of bottles, each labeled with cryptic symbols. On a hunch, I grabbed one that matched a symbol I had seen in Wilkes's journal, a symbol associated with transformation. Just then, the stone door exploded inward, and the beast stood framed in the entrance, its yellow eyes blazing with hunger and rage. "Nowhere left to run, Conlon," it growled, advancing on me. In desperation, I uncorked the bottle and flung its contents at the beast. The liquid hit its fur and immediately began to smoke and sizzle. The beast howled in agony, its form rippling and shifting. To my amazement, the creature before me began to shrink, its bestial features melting away to reveal Graham's human form. He fell to his knees, gasping and retching. "Graham?" I said cautiously, not daring to hope. He looked up at me, his eyes clear and human once more. "Conlon, what happened? The last thing I remember is being in the woods and then—" His words were cut off by another roar, but this one didn't come from him. From the shadows of the lab emerged another beast, larger and more terrifying than the one Graham had been. "Fools!" it bellowed in Jeremiah's voice. "Did you think I would be so easily defeated? This house, this land, they are me and I am them. I cannot be destroyed." As the true Jeremiah advanced on us, the symbols on the walls of the lab began to glow once more, pulsing with that same otherworldly energy we had seen before. The air crackled with power, and I could feel reality itself seeming to warp around us. In that moment, I understood. The lab wasn't just a place of science and dark magic. It was a nexus, a point where the fabric of our world was thin, and right now it was reacting to the abomination that Jeremiah had become. "Graham," I shouted over the rising din, "we need to get out of here. Now!" We scrambled for the entrance, even as Jeremiah lunged for us. But before he could reach us, a blinding light filled the lab. I felt a tremendous force, as if the very air was being sucked out of the room. Jeremiah's roar turned to a scream of terror and rage. I caught one last glimpse of him, his form twisting and dissolving in the light, before Graham and I were flung out of the lab and into the cool night air. We hit the ground hard, rolling several feet before coming to a stop. When I looked up, the lab was gone. In its place was nothing but undisturbed forest floor, as if the structure had never existed. Graham and I looked at each other, both of us battered, exhausted, and struggling to process what had just happened. "Is it over?" Graham asked, his voice hoarse. I looked back at where the lab had been, then towards the plantation house in the distance. The oppressive feeling that had hung over the property was gone. The air felt lighter, cleaner somehow. "I think so," I said slowly. I think Jeremiah's finally gone. Really gone this time." We made our way back to the plantation house, moving cautiously, half expecting the beast to jump out at us at any moment. But the house stood silent and still, looking once more like the abandoned, dilapidated structure it had been when we first arrived. As the first rays of dawn began to peek over the horizon, Graham and I sat on the porch steps, trying to come to terms with everything that had happened. "What do we do now?" Graham asked, running a hand through his hair. I thought for a moment, then pulled out my phone. "First, we call the police, tell them everything. With both of us corroborating the story, and with Wilkes's journal as evidence, they'll have to believe us." Graham nodded slowly. "And after that?" I looked out over the overgrown lawn towards the bayou beyond. "After that, I think we have a story to tell, a warning to share." Graham nodded, understanding dawning in his eyes. "You're going to write about this, aren't you?" "I have to," I replied. "People need to know the truth about what happened here. about the dangers of meddling with forces we don't understand. We sat in silence for a few moments, watching as the sun slowly rose, painting the sky in hues of pink and orange. The beauty of the dawn stood in stark contrast to the horrors we had experienced. "What about the plantation?" Graham asked eventually. "What should we do with it?" I considered the question carefully. I think we should let it go. Let nature reclaim it. Some places are better left undisturbed." Graham agreed, and over the next few weeks we worked with the authorities to piece together the full story of Jeremiah Wilkes and the Bayou Beast. The journal proved to be a treasure trove of information, shedding light on decades of mysterious disappearances and unexplained events in the area. As for me, I threw myself into writing, determined to chronicle our experiences and the dark history of Cypress Grove Plantation. The story was met with skepticism by some, but for those who had lived in the shadow of the Bayou Beast legend for generations, it brought a sense of closure. Graham decided to leave New Orleans, the memories of his possession too painful to bear. But we stayed in touch, bonded by our shared ordeal. Years have passed since that terrifying night in the bayou. Cypress Grove Plantation still stands, slowly being reclaimed by the wilderness. No one has lived there since, and locals give the property a wide berth. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I find myself thinking back to those events. I wonder if we truly banished Jeremiah Wilkes, or if some echo of him still lingers in the dark corners of the bayou. And I'm reminded that there are forces in this world beyond our understanding, mysteries that perhaps are best left unsolved. But I also remember the strength we found in facing our fears, in standing up to the darkness. And I know that whatever other secrets the world may hold, we have the courage to face them. As for me, I've never lost my taste for adventure or my curiosity about the unknown. But now, I approach such things with a newfound respect and caution. After all, you never know when you might stumble upon another story as terrifying and life-changing as the legend of the Bayou Beast.